Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to introduce you again to Steve Lafleur. He is a public policy analyst. He's an urban and regional policy specialist, really working to try to improve urban life in Canada. And he and a co-author of recently with the Ontario 360 project at the University of Toronto Monk's School of Global Affairs and Public Policy have issued a really interesting review of where housing stock grew in the GTA, and it's got an interesting answer, which I worry means that it's just downtown and not everywhere else it should be. Steve Lafleur, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming back, because we've had some interesting conversations in the past. So tell me, if you could, about this report that you've recently issued and what the answer is from the report.
Yeah, so we've written a number of reports lately, all trying to get at this in different ways. It's a little bit difficult to describe since it's a map that's our primary piece of data, but essentially what we've done is we've mapped out all the census tracts in the GTA to try to determine between 2016 and 2021 what happened to the housing stock. In other words, did it stay the same? Did it grow? Or did it even shrink? Now, if you're looking at the map, you'll see a lot of pink, which might be surprising because the pink means unit losses. So what that means between 2016 and 2021, a lot of the map of the GTA has actually lost housing units. Now, granted, in most cases, it's a small number, and a lot of times it might be explainable by things like, for instance, at Yonge and Bloor, taking down some housing stock to put up bigger housing and so forth. There can be a lot of reasons for it, but the reality is that when you look at those two census periods, a lot of the map is pink. That's a problem. You can excuse away why there might be, 5 units lost here and 10 units there, et cetera. But what you can't excuse away is the fact that nothing else has been built incrementally in a lot of these places.
And so the growth that you found was also primarily downtown, almost within, a short distance from Union Station. What's the implication of that?
Yeah, so what we found is there's kind of what we describe as a donut pattern in the GTA. So if you take Union Station as a center, and if you draw a 3-kilometer radius around it, a strong proportion of the development has happened right in that 3-kilometer radius. Now, if you go out from that radius to the next 31 kilometers out, which includes nearly all of Mississauga's boundaries, by the way, you get very slow growth compared to downtown. And then if you get out further than that, which is past Mississauga, you have some growth in a lot of the smaller communities. For instance, New Tecumseh or Newmarket and so forth, largely kind of more subdivisions, I believe, is the case there. So we've kind of got the hyperdensity around Union Station and a couple of other kind of urban nodes, including around Square One, by the way, in Mississauga. But for the most part, what we describe as tall and sprawl is what's happening. You either get towers that are mostly around Union Station and a couple of other very high density areas, and you get sprawl that's not even in the cities of Mississauga and Brampton and so forth necessarily, but even further out. So it's meant that we have really not met the objectives, I think, that we set out when we came up with GTA growth management plans in the early 2000s that were essentially meant to densify existing neighborhoods. What in fact it's done is it's just been concentrated in a few areas, and we've just pushed sprawl further out.
And so what's the implication of that? That not every city is participating in sort of the growth that we need, or what?
Yes. You can slice it a number of ways. Many parts of the city of Toronto proper have seen very stagnant growth. Many parts of Mississauga as well. And what that means is that you've got more people who are moving further and further out, putting further strains on the infrastructure because existing communities that have the infrastructure to accommodate more people aren't doing so. Now, the good news is that a lot of recent reforms to housing policy in the GTA will eventually help to change that. For instance, in Mississauga, the decision to take part of the Housing Accelerator Fund program means that the city is going to upzone to 4 units on a single detached lot, which means you can build fourplexes. That doesn't change the community overnight. That is very incremental growth. It takes time. Not everybody is going to convert their house into a fourplex tomorrow, but it does give the city options to add housing units, because really Mississauga has effectively run out of room to sprawl. The only way to add housing units is to add density. And given the growth of the GTA, that's going to have to happen. Having very low density housing mandated by the government adjacent to the center of the Canadian economy just isn't sustainable.
This chart that you've got that really compares the proximity to Union Station and where density occurs is really quite fascinating. And I wonder if you could talk about the implications of it, because what it says is that there's a huge amount of density, like a massive amount of density within sort of, 1 to 2 kilometers of Union Station, and then not a lot at all. And then a bunch of increase in density way out, which is, I guess, your tall and sprawl kind of headline to your article or your report. But it's going to put, a huge demand on infrastructure right near Union Station. It's going to be, a almost ghetto is not the right word, but almost a Manhattanization of the area right around Union Station. And we've all seen that with some of the descriptions of, all the development that's taking place. But shouldn't there be other dense pockets elsewhere in the GTA that aren't all the way out in the periphery, that are, according to your numbers, like 30, no, not even 30, 40 kilometers out from Union Station?
Yeah, before I get to your question, I'm just going to jump on something you said about Manhattanization. I think that's a really important point. One of the things that motivated us to write this is that a lot of people, when they come to Toronto, they look around Union Station, they see a lot of condos being built, and they say, hey, there's a big condo boom here. We're building plenty of housing. I guess that we're fine. But that's because they're just looking at that 3-kilometer radius. So it really skews our perspective. When you look at the broader map of the GTA, that's just not the case. There's plenty of area that is not growing, and the challenge from that one you pointed out is infrastructure. It means that we need to build more and more infrastructure to service communities further and further out, but it also means that there are neighborhoods that have the infrastructure already that aren't allowing more housing, and that's a big problem, because if you think about it, when you're building infrastructure, you want to use it to its maximum, or at least you don't want to have single detached houses within 5-minute walk of a subway station in Toronto, because that means you're not using that infrastructure to its full capacity. The other challenge is that what it also means is you're not building a lot of types of housing that are more affordable. So a large lot detached house out on the urban fringe is probably not going to be, an affordable house for somebody who's, a working class person. A condo right by Union Station is going to be more expensive than one that's, 10, 20 kilometers out. So we need to have more of those housing options that are more affordable for people who can't afford to, move right near Union Station. So that kind of missing middle of housing is really crucial to getting housing prices down, because, when you think about it, if you build 4 units on one lot, all of a sudden you effectively cut the land cost in 4. So that gives people a greater opportunity to be able to afford that type of housing. Now, a lot of people are going to want detached houses, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think we need to give people more options to be able to, buy things they can frankly afford. If we think that we're going to build enough detached houses at the urban fringe to bring down housing costs, that's probably not going to happen.
I agree with you, but I really wonder whether people are really going to take their homes and split their lots into 4, and whether that's going to be a few people or a lot of people. And it sounds like good public policy, but I wonder if it actually solves the problem. And when you think about, the typical floor plate of a condo is 8 to 10 units. So it's a lot easier to get some of that extra space by building one more floor of a condo or a rental apartment than it is taking every every house and trying to get people to convince them to renovate them to a fourplex. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and be back in 2 minutes with Steve Lafleur. We're talking about where is the density that is being built in the Greater Toronto Area. And, really what I want to address is, are city officials in the different parts of the GTA doing their job? Or are they really being a block to development? Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Steve Lafleur. He is a urban policy analyst and someone that I've invited on my show a few times because the man is a really smart guy. He's done some really interesting analysis on what's going on in urban centers, primarily the GTA, but elsewhere as well in Canada. And I think he's really trying to figure out with some of the people that he's working with how to fix some of the urban challenges that we have in Canada, which is obviously a big problem, as we all know, with housing affordability, lack of density, lack of housing, building, etc. Steve, your map is really kind of interesting, and I really want to bring it back to you again, if I could, because what it suggests is that, you take a look at Mississauga as one example. And when I first saw your map, I was thinking that you were doing percentage. And when it was percentage, I thought it actually might have made more sense, but it's actually units. And so, because you saw some of the areas that are increasing a lot, being in the outskirts of the GTA, and I figured, oh, well, that's percentage increase, but it's not percentage increase. It's actually, units. And so some of the areas on the periphery must be building whole new subdivisions that are actually benefiting the housing stock in the whole area. But then I took a look at Mississauga and Brampton, frankly, and a lot of it is, really small in the incremental development. And I think about some of the the developments taking place. It's astounding to me that it's not that big. And other than downtown Toronto, a lot of Toronto is similarly not developing that much. But York was developing a fair amount. There was a lot of development in York. And when I think about York or even Durham, it's as dense as Mississauga. So is York doing something right and progressive that Mississauga is not?
I think a lot of the development is really idiosyncratic because with the heavily restrictive zoning rules we've had for most of the last half century or longer in the GTA, a lot of dense development has been very hard to do. So typically what we've seen in Canada in terms of densification recently, it's been because there's a particular opportunity, because there's old industrial land somewhere, or like a derelict neighborhood. You can think about like East Village in Calgary, where I used to live. It was, kind of a derelict neighborhood that they just decided that it was an opportunity to build a lot of dense housing, and they were able to do it because they didn't have to knock down a lot of things. That's not an opportunity that exists everywhere, particularly in, say, Mississauga, for instance, because a lot of the housing stock is newer. So you're not just necessarily going to pull down a subdivision and try to rezone it. So a lot of times development just happens where there is an idiosyncratic opportunity, whether it's, a lot of right now, a lot of densification happening in the GTA is happening in things like, malls, for instance. A lot of old malls, the companies that own them understand that the business model is changing and the land is really valuable. So guess what? They've got big parking lots. They can add incremental housing. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. But back to your point about fourplexes, it's a new standard that is being established for Canadian cities, which is good and something that should have been the case 50 years ago and would have made a meaningful difference. Unfortunately, once you've got a neighborhood built, it takes time to actually see the benefit of upzoning like that, because to your point, not everybody's going to do that. In fact, most people probably won't. It is a start. And I do think that we have to get serious about the next steps, which in a lot of cases, particularly in Toronto, will have to be talking about allowing apartments in neighborhoods. And that won't go over so easily, I'm sure, but we've got a math problem here. Toronto and the GTA are growing really quickly. We've effectively run out of room to sprawl. there are some pockets that are further and further out, which means that people have to drive further and further, and we're going to add more and more traffic congestion because we're just not going to start building new highways in the city of Toronto. So something's going to have to give, and that means we're going to have to make tougher decisions with existing neighborhoods in existing cities that already have the infrastructure to accommodate more people.
Well, if you take a look at, and I know you follow, I think it's called Future Vision TO or something like that, the development that's going to be taking place in the same area that you've already shown has taken place, within 2 kilometers of Union Station, is incredible. It's dramatic. It's unbelievable what is going to take place in the future. And so therefore, there is going to be a fair amount of new housing stock coming on in that same area right downtown. But what you quote in your article is kind of scary, because what you say is that Scotiabank Economics estimated in 2022 that Ontario needs 650,000 housing units to reach the same per capita level of housing as other provinces. And you say 1.2 million to reach the average of the G7. So we are dramatically underhoused. And you wonder, where people are living. And you go on and you say that in the 1970s, one house was built for every 2 additional people moving into Ontario. That grew in the 2010s to 1 for every 4, but it's now growing in 22 to 1 for every 6. So, Steve, where are people staying? Where are they living?
Well, one of the short answers is that people just are increasingly living with their parents. It's the idea that somebody who's, say 35 years old, earning an entry-level salary is going to be able to buy a house in Toronto or even Mississauga is not realistic right now. So people are having to plan around it, which is a problem when you think about it. At some point in your life, you would hope you'd be able to move out and have your own place, maybe have a family and so forth. But we're just making it impossible for people, which means a lot of people are just leaving the province entirely. As we saw,
but they're not leaving the province, because these numbers suggest they're still coming to the province.
I think there's a churn. So there are a lot of people who are getting pushed out and a lot of people who are coming in. So for instance, during, the last couple of years, Alberta has gone back to receiving heavy inflows of interprovincial migration, a lot of it from Ontario, the East Coast and so forth. A lot of people are picking up and leaving, but because there are really strong immigration numbers, that means that there are a lot of people who are coming in from the rest of the world. And realistically, most people who move to Canada move to GTA, Montreal, Lower Mainland, maybe Calgary or Edmonton or Ottawa. So it's a small number of places that people settle. And Toronto is the biggest beneficiary, but that also means that we need to do the most in order to accommodate population. And frankly, as the map shows, very few parts of the GTA are actually doing it.
So what's the answer?
I think we need to stop looking at housing as kind of a luxury. We kind of get bogged down in things. We worry that, building more luxury housing is not going to help anybody. No, that's not true. We have a math problem. We need to build more units in order to house people. We come up with all kinds of excuses why it's not something we really need. We don't need another glass tower here and so forth. We do. Unless we're going to change the math somehow, unless we're going to all of a sudden stop growth in the GTA, which I don't think is something we really want to contemplate, given our demographics and given our need for labor. So we need to get serious about the growth of the province. And it's not even just housing, it's also things like transportation. We're always thinking about the thing that we needed to build 20 years ago that we're now building. We need to think out, what is the GTA going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years and beyond, and recognize that we're going to need more infrastructure. And the longer we wait for these things and the longer we wait to plan these things, the more we get mugged by reality when it happens. For those of us who live in Toronto right now, for instance, particularly on the east side of Toronto, we're in a real reckoning because the Ontario line, formerly the downtown relief line, which was something that was contemplated decades ago, is finally getting built, which is great, but also it's happening way too late. And now we're dealing with traffic gridlock forever because we didn't do this when we should have done it decades ago.
Steve, let's talk about downtown Toronto. You know, you mentioned that there's a huge amount of development that has taken place in the last 5 years in the area that's 2 kilometers from Union Station. But if you take a look at the projects that are currently under construction and the ones that are proposed, it really is a huge amount of development that is proposed. Do you think that the stuff that's proposed that's currently being applied for at the City of Toronto won't get built, or will it get built and still that's not enough?
I'm working under the assumption that it will get built. Demand for housing is so strong that, you know, we might, who knows what'll happen over the next 2-3 years with, you know, tightening financial conditions and so forth. Long term, there's so much demand for housing in downtown Toronto. Yeah, I assume it'll be built, and yet it doesn't look like it'll be enough. I mean, I kind of chuckled when you mentioned the Scotiabank numbers, because there have been so many new reports that have come out, and with revised population growth estimates and so forth, nobody really even knows what the number is. The numbers are so high of how much housing we need in Ontario and Canada that every time we revise it up, you know, you think about the incremental amounts we're revising it up by, and the incremental revisions are more than I expect us to actually do. So it's really daunting.
So the development is taking place downtown, and it's taking place in sprawls outside of sort of built up areas of the GTA, but it's not taking place in the existing, 416 and 905 suburbs. Why? Is it just NIMBYism? What's causing the lack of development?
It's largely zoning. So for instance, if you look at the portion of Toronto that was zoned for residential, 2/3 or more of it was exclusively zoned for single detached housing up until the recent reforms. But what that means is, if you go back, you think about development in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, that meant that a lot of subdivisions were still getting built in the city of Toronto. That if we could go back in time, it would be really great if they were, you know, much more dense neighborhoods, kind of like you see in the older parts of Toronto, where they're not, you know, characterized by high rises and so forth, but they're more kind of row houses and townhouses, duplexes. So, you know, if you have a neighborhood of duplexes versus detached houses, you have quite a bit more density. But that wasn't legal in most of Toronto until very recently, and most of the GTA for that matter. So what that means is we kind of used up all the greenfield on detached houses that aren't very dense.
You know, I think it'll be interesting to see how many people actually convert their homes to duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes or whatever. It'll be interesting to see. So it's zoning restrictions is the argument. In Mississauga, Lakeview Generating Power Station had a certain amount of zoning that was approved by the city of Mississauga through a whole negotiation process between the city and the developer and the community, et cetera. And then there was an MZO that doubled the density. And the argument the provincial government made, and this was, you know, applied in other areas as well, but in that specific area, was that you had this big, huge piece of property that sticks into Lake Ontario that was an old power generating station. It has less of an impact, therefore, on neighboring communities, and it should therefore be one of those areas that could have increased density. And they doubled the density. And some people were shocked by the doubling of the density. And the provincial government did say that maybe we should put another GO train station in the area to provide better transit to the area. But that was a pretty dramatic increase. And I think you were talking about potentially, 15,000 people going to 30,000 people. It's the kind of increased capacity. Now, given the Greenbelt fiasco and some of the issues in regards to urban boundary expansions and other investigations into MZOs, there's a risk that might be changed, and there's calls to investigate that and potentially appeal to the cabinet to change it. That's one example. What do you think is the answer in that situation? Was the original density right?
This is a big part of the problem with having so much political discretion involved in these things. If you have things that are zoned as of right, for instance, in other words, you don't need to apply for any kind of rezoning, then it means that you're not subjected to these arbitrary whims. There isn't the uncertainty and so forth. And granted, when you're talking about much larger projects, we're probably not going to upzone as of right to 50 stories and so forth. But I do think that you need to have more clearer processes, and a lot of the reasons why we get into this scenario with MZOs is precisely that we don't build enough housing. The strain is there, and politicians grasp for what's easiest. What's easiest? Well, it's old industrial land. Back to my example from Calgary, or if you think of it like Olympic Village in Vancouver, like these are the types of places that are easier to build, so you get more density built.
It's a big issue that politics has ended up being a big problem. But I guess with the way that our government system is structured, and people can have such an influence on community planning and on the city councilors and on the mayors that have to approve the zoning, I guess that's the result, is it not?
Well, I think there's also a challenge with the lack of intergovernmental coordination. One thing, for instance, is that immigration targets tend not to really consider, or haven't really historically considered, housing capacity. That's something that the federal government said they're going to look at now, which is needed. But I think that it makes it hard for municipalities to plan when they don't really know what the growth targets are going to look like. And it also, frankly, makes it easier for them to say no to things when you've got a lower target, you've got a lower number in mind for growth, and then subsequently we grow more than we think. That makes it easier when we don't have realistic projections in advance. So I think that we need to do a better job of coordinating among levels of government. The municipalities are, in many respects, the most to blame because they control housing most directly. But it is also the case that other levels of government need to do a better job of coordinating with them.
You previously posted a chart in regards to the housing that was being built in Canada over time. And it was really kind of interesting to me because what it showed is that we're actually building less houses in absolute units today than we were in the 1970s. And yet our population has doubled since the 1970s. And we are building less single family homes. And so, given that, there's no way that I can think that we're actually going to have enough laborers to double or triple our construction of single family homes. So what's the answer?
So housing completions have decreased since the 70s, and also, to your point, single family houses have as well, because we've run out of room to sprawl. Now, one of the big challenges, and like with that particular figure that you've got, one of the challenges is that, so for people who can't see the figure, who are listening in, the number of semi-detached houses and row houses has stayed pretty flat. And if you want to add more, kind of what we call ground-oriented housing, meaning housing that has where you can have a yard, for instance, even if it's a small yard, you can fit in more housing units that have the kind of amenities that people with families, for instance, might prefer. If you have denser forms of housing like row houses, townhouses, and so forth. But we really just haven't legalized them in most places. I mean, frankly, now with what's being done through the Housing Accelerator Fund, that's becoming the new standard for zoning in Canada, which is great. But that takes time to add density that way. And if you think about the GTA, you really need to start talking about adding more towers in more places, or at least small apartment buildings. Because when you've got large swaths of the GTA that aren't adding a lot of housing, despite the fact that they've got a lot of infrastructure, that means you need to put it somewhere else where you need to add more infrastructure. And that's really a lost opportunity. And it means that, what you're saying to people is, instead of you can live in a townhouse in Scarborough, where you've got a somewhat reasonable commute to work, you need to move out to East Gwillimbury instead, where you've got a much longer commute. And that doesn't really seem like a fair thing to do to people.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Stephen Lafleur, a urban affairs expert, commentator, author of numerous different fascinating reports on the issue of housing supply, housing affordability, et cetera, in Canada. When we come back, I'm going to ask him about the role that immigration plays in this issue, because he's also written a report for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on the role of immigration. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur. He's an urban affairs commentator, analyst, expert, someone that's written numerous different papers on what's going on. And he's recently penned a report for the Monk School of Public Policy on where housing that has been built in the GTA has been built. And it's either right downtown and I presume that's apartment buildings and height, condo buildings and height, and or right on the periphery. And so it's sprawl, and it's the balance of the GTA, primarily the inner suburbs in the 416 and the parts of the 905 that have been built up in the past that just aren't keeping up with the housing. But this is complicated, Steve, by our increase in immigration. Is it not? And you've written a paper on this. Tell me a little bit about what you think the role of immigration is. Is this helpful or harmful to the situation, given that, the chart that you've got in your paper shows a fairly substantial increase in immigration, which, I think we know. Now, births are down dramatically, but nothing comparable to the dramatic increase in immigration.
Yeah. So back to what I was saying about coordination and planning. So the CMHC has been tracking the backlog of housing in Canada, for instance. And, they've come up with so many numbers, I've lost track of which is which. But, they came out with a big number that needed to be built. And then all of a sudden, immigration targets went up. And they were irrelevant basically immediately, because if you have more people coming in, you need more housing. It's just math. Trouble is that there isn't just a quick and easy dial we can turn to have more housing happen. The housing industry isn't exactly sitting on its hands right now. There is a reasonable amount of housing being built. It's just not enough to keep up. Now, could we theoretically keep up? Absolutely. Have we made the political decisions to keep up? No. Are we going to get there anytime soon? It seems really doubtful. So when you think about growing the population, if you're not also thinking about how to house them, you run into really big problems. And that's where we are today, frankly.
And so what's your answer? That we should restrict immigration, or we should build more housing?
I'm a maximum Canada guy. I think that we should, be looking at growing our population through immigration, accept the best and the brightest. I like the idea of the West overgrowing the autocracies in the world. We should try to outgrow Russia and China in the West. Dude, that's great. Let's take all their best people and let's grow the economy and let's overgrow the autocracies. But we're not serious about that, unfortunately. So what do we have to do in the short term? Well, we probably need to think about some of the sources of migration, like temporary residents, non-permanent residents, for instance. There's been a real explosion, a lot of them in higher education, for instance. If we don't have the capacity to house people, it really doesn't serve anybody to dial up the number of non-permanent residents in the country. Then there's also the overall immigration level, which the immigration minister recently announced they're going to be holding flat after, I think it's 2026. It might be the case that we might want to actually, in fact, instead of going up to 500,000, maybe we want to, go more slowly, or even cap it where we are right now. Unless we're going to pull 50,000 extra houses out of our hat, adding an extra 50,000 people and so forth. It's hard to make that math work.
So in your paper, you identified a few problems. The first one we talked about, which is home building is not keeping up with population growth. The second we just talking about right now, which is that decisions in immigration don't necessarily match up with the housing, the issues we got. But then I found your third one really kind of interesting, and maybe we could chat with it for a while. You said that supply growth planning is lengthy, poorly anticipates demand, and is poorly enforced. And you referenced a couple of different growth plans that we've had in the past that took a long time to implement, and that they didn't necessarily match demand. But then you said even those were never enforced. What do you mean by they were never enforced?
Yeah, I mean, we have growth targets and so forth, but unless there's some sort of way of enforcing it. So, for instance, the Conservatives, since Aaron O'Toole's leadership, always had the idea of tying infrastructure funding to housing built. So, in other words, if you don't build enough housing, you don't get infrastructure funding or you lose some amount of it. So, that'd be one way you can enforce it. Another way is the way that the current federal government has started to enforce it, which is essentially using the Housing Accelerator Fund to incentivize municipalities to make changes to their zoning that will increase the number of units that get built. So there are a lot of ways to coordinate, but I think that's really the important part. You know, for a long time we just kind of said, okay, the federal government doesn't really have a direct role in housing. Well, it does. The federal government is determining what the population growth is. And if we're just going to kind of play a game where the federal government doesn't talk to the municipalities and the provincial government gives targets to municipalities that they're not going to enforce, well, that's how we end up in a situation where we are right now, where we're all behind and trying to figure out what to do to catch up.
You know, the issue that you identify is pretty scary, and what you talk about is that we've dramatically underbuilt, and that we've dramatically underbuilt relative to other G7 countries, and you reference that not only does Canada have the largest gap between home prices and incomes among G7 nations, but shelter costs have steadily eroded earnings in most Canadian cities in recent decades. Do we really have the largest gap between home prices and incomes among all G7 nations?
Yeah, so if you look at the ratio between the median income and median housing price, that's how you get there. And I believe it might have been the case a couple of years ago that Australia was higher, for instance. But it's a small number of countries that are in that group, in that conversation, that are just dramatically more expensive than the rest of the G7. And I think that we really need to take this seriously, because if you're going to compete for talent with the United States, for instance, how do you get somebody to come to the GTA to work in tech, which, by the way, pays less than, say, California, and pay, $1.5 million for a condo? That's a hard case to make.
So if it's housing relative to income, I guess there's two issues. What our median income levels are like versus international comparables, as well as what are our housing prices. There was a major report that came out I think this summer, that said that our median household income was 30% below the United States. And, maybe a decade ago or something like that, it was close to being on par. So is our lack of growth in income the problem, or our outsized growth in housing prices?
Well, I would say both. A lot of places that have similarly or even more irrational housing policies than, say, the GTA have kind of skated along because their incomes are so high. And I'm thinking about San Francisco in particular. The San Francisco Bay Area is the most NIMBY place in maybe the known universe, or has been until very recently. If you stand up on one of the towers downtown and look around, you'll see oceans of detached houses right by the ocean, where you would think, it would look something maybe more like Brooklyn or Manhattan. No, it looks like a small town in a lot of respects. So they've managed to overcome that to an extent by just having gigantic incomes. Now, it's changed a bit since COVID and so forth, and it did still nevertheless mean that a lot of people were priced out. And you could read all kinds of stories about people like renting closets in apartments, but because they had such high incomes, they were still able to attract people at the top end of the talent pool. By contrast, it's hard to make the case for if you're paying 25% less to move to Toronto, and housing prices are, on par with a lot of other big unaffordable cities. What's the business case there? If you can move to somewhere like Denver and housing prices are lower and you're getting paid more, if you've got the choice, which a lot of people do, a lot of the most sought after talent has a lot of choice as to where they want to move. Well, it's just hard to make the case when you're paying less and it costs more.
So if governments don't solve this problem by approving more housing demand, what's the implication? Is it that people will start to move to Calgary or Denver, or that we'll just be even more house poor in Toronto?
I think a combination of all the above. Not everybody is mobile enough to just pick up and leave. It's a hard decision. I lived a decade of my life out west, which is it's far from friends and family and so forth. Not everybody's going to make that decision. Not everybody can make that decision. Similarly, not everybody can pick up and move to Chicago or wherever their preferred city is to move to work. But at the margin, we will lose a lot of people who could otherwise be outsized contributors to the economy. You think about some of these people who've crossed through Canada and ended up in the U.S. In the tech sector, and I'll give you one example just of the opportunity cost that cities face. Microsoft, like Bill Gates, if I remember, was it Bill Gates? Pretty sure it's Bill Gates who lived in New Mexico and moved to Seattle. I mean, you could say that changed the fortune of Seattle just by one guy moving, right? Elon Musk went to Queens. Now he's living in Texas. You want to try to compete to attract the best talent because they bring so much economic heft with them. Innovation is so important to modern economies. And if you're not even in the conversation for the top talent, which I got to think at some point we're not going to be, it's a big loss. It means that the most innovative people in the world will say, okay, Toronto's nice, but also I can move stateside and pay less and earn way more. So I'm going to do that.
We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur. He's an urban affairs expert about the challenge in Toronto and a recent paper that he's issued that really suggests that we've got development that's taking place downtown Toronto within 2 kilometers of Union Station and sprawl on the edges of our 905. But the balance of the GTA doesn't really have a lot of development taking place, and that's what's got to change in the future if we're going to be able to address our need for housing supply. And I do think, Steve, that there is some development. And when we come back from a break, I want to challenge you in that regard and see what you think. The reason why some of that development is at least being proposed, and why we can't have more, because I think it is an interesting sort of however to your analysis that may be true in the past, but is it true in the future, and can we change it? Stay with us, everyone. We're going to come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Steve Lafleur. He is a urban affairs public policy analyst and expert. He's an author of numerous different studies, one most recently on development taking place primarily in the last half a decade in within 2 kilometers of Union Station and also suburban sprawl right on the edges of the periphery of our urban area, but not within the balance of Toronto. He's also written an article for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in regards to immigration and how that's making the housing issue even more challenging. Another article that's really interesting that says that we have the worst housing to income ratio in the whole G7, which is just shocking. And I think it's a travesty, and it tells us that our public policy governmental people are not doing something right. Steve, on the top, you mentioned that there's some development happening in shopping centers. And I think that is an interesting development. And I want to ask you, why? Because it is sort of an answer to some of the challenge that you talked about in regards to the development not taking place sort of in the donut. And, Scarborough Town Center, there's 70 towers proposed and 30,000 people. Agincourt Mall, 4,300 units. Fairview Mall, 4,300 units. Bayview Village Mall, 2,000 units. Centerport Mall, 25,000 units. Yorkdale Mall, more than 10,000 units. Sherway Gardens, 3,000 units. Cloverdale Mall, which is this old, suburban mall, almost 6,000 units. Dufferin Mall in the center of the city, sort of 3,000 units. Why are those developments taking place at shopping centers?
So shopping centers are, to an extent, a bit of a relic of old land use planning policies. And while the death of the mall has been greatly exaggerated, malls aren't as valuable real estate as they used to be for the most part. What they do have is they have big parking lots, which means they've got a lot of space to put down new housing on. So it's like the lowest of low hanging fruit. And back to our conversation earlier about old industrial land and so forth, it's much easier politically to build on, an old mall than it is to build in an existing neighborhood. So it's no surprise that these gigantic developments are happening in those places because developers want to build as many units as they can. The market needs way more units than that to begin with. So that's the low hanging fruit. That's the easy place to do it.
And I think it's low hanging fruit, primarily because there's not neighbors that are complaining.
Yes,
building in parking
correct.
lots.
Yes,
one of
parking
the other
lots
trends.
Don't complain, neighbors do.
Right. One of the other trends is development around major transit areas, and so therefore there's a fair amount of proposal. On Yonge Street, north of the 401, along the Yonge subway station, also at Yonge and Steeles, where they're going to be extending the subway, and interesting enough, connected with the same discussion we just had, built on a shopping center. Don Mills and Shepherd, which is again the Shepherd subway, the 404, etc. But then, interesting enough, a huge amount of development at Don Mills and Eglinton, which is going to be where the Eglinton Crosstown and the Ontario line intersect, in Scarborough, along potentially the extension of the Eglinton Crosstown, in Islington, where you've got the GO train and the subway, down by the waterfront, but they're talking about building a potential new GO train station in the Mr. Christie site, and Scarborough Town Center around the shopping center and the extension of the Scarborough subway, and as well sort of near Bloor and Dundas, and the GO train station in Weston. So again, there is this change to potentially what's happened in the past, which you describe as primarily downtown and the suburbs, by developing around transit stations. Is that a good idea?
So yes, needs to happen. Absolutely. Good development. However, I will note, for those who can see the maps on the screen that you just went through, it is in large respect the same tall and sprawl idea, in that you've got all this upzoning right along these narrow corridors like the Yonge corridor, but then you've got all these oceans of detached houses around, not duplexes, triplexes, walk-ups, and so forth, and small apartments, detached or tall. That tall and sprawl mentality really is a large part of the problem, because yes, it's true, the absolute best place to put dense housing is right next to a subway station or a GO station. But there's all this land, just slightly beyond it, where people could easily walk to public transit and would love to if it was possible for them to, but they can't. And what that means is, in a lot of these neighborhoods, which, you think about it, there have been people living there for decades who started out as, 5 people families, for instance, and now are 2 people families, probably don't commute to work anymore. So you've got all this housing that could be used to get people and their families to and from home, the office, etc. But it's not possible. Instead, we've got, underutilized housing with empty bedrooms, where we could have much denser housing. And that doesn't have to mean, all high rises and so forth. A lot of the time when we talk about densification, it sounds scary. But if you think about a lot of the older neighborhoods in the GTA that were built before, or that were at least partially built before modern urban planning, you see kind of a comfortable mix of townhouses, walk-up apartments, and so forth. Like I live in East Toronto, and we don't have, really any towers around here, or not many anyway. What we mostly have is attached houses, and they're, you know, they're nothing special, but they're extremely desired. People spend a lot of money to live in these neighborhoods because they're by amenities. So the idea that, densifying a neighborhood will turn it into some sort of, undesirable place is just probably not true. I think that if we look at our past and we look at some of the older neighborhoods, it shows us that we can build very desirable places that accommodate a lot more people, that still have a lot of the things that people look for in a neighborhood. If you've got a row house in my neighborhood, you've got some grass, you can have a garden, etc. And that means that all the side streets are quite dense compared to what they are in like a cul-de-sac. So you've got modest density on the side streets, and you can accommodate, more density on the main streets, like Queen Street. It can be done in a way that's very hospitable. You think about the places that people who have the opportunity to move anywhere move to. You think about the list, and a lot of these places are quite dense. Brooklyn, for instance, is dense yet not mostly towers. East Toronto is like that. There are a lot of ways that you can house people in more dense settings that aren't undesirable and that are in fact some of the most desirable places in the world. So I think we need to get past the idea that, the first choice should be in a cul-de-sac detached house. Not everybody wants to live that way, and frankly, not everybody can live that way. I certainly am not going to go out and buy I'm not going to qualify for a mortgage to go and buy a detached house out in, one of these new subdivisions. And most people who are, who aren't in the housing market probably don't have that opportunity either, unless they've got family money.
Steve Lafleur, thank you very much for joining us and telling us a little bit about the housing crisis that we've got. I want to underline a couple of facts that you've stated in your analyses and in the conversation today. Number one, you described how we've got the biggest gap between incomes and housing prices in the G7. That's a huge problem, and it's a problem with our incomes, and it's a huge problem with our housing prices. Number two, you said that we're building less housing stock today than we built in the 1970s when the population has doubled. And so clearly that's a per capita housing problem and challenge. And number three, you said that the housing that we are building is either tall within 2 kilometers of Union Station and or right on the edge of the urban envelope in the periphery of our suburbs, i.e. sprawl. And the vast majority of Toronto is not really addressing the problem. At least so far, it's not. And that's obviously an issue. And then the final thing is that in a lot of your assessments, you're not blaming developers. You say immigration may be capped, but you're not actually blaming immigration. I think what you're effectively saying is government policy has been the problem. Government policy that has put in place zoning, has not implemented and or enforced growth plans correctly, that is given into NIMBYism, that isn't allowing the kind of development that we need to have take place. And so I really appreciate you raising these issues and coming up with some of these conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I think this is sort of the number one issue in the GTA. If you thought that climate change was sort of the issue of our generation, and I know there's arguments on both sides of that, but climate change is the sort of the long-term big issue. I think this is the medium-term issue. Inflation, interest rates might be the short-term issue. I think housing is the medium-term issue, and maybe climate change is the long-term issue. We need more housing, and we need government and everyone else to get on board to make sure that we, effectively double the number of housing units that we're currently building. Thanks, everyone. Good night.